Hello there, and welcome to Cell Biology Lesson 10. This is your last lesson in this booklet. Well done for getting this far. And this one is going to be on active transport. All right. So before we begin, just again, make sure you have all the tools that you need: pen, pencil, highlighter, ruler, and make sure you're also in a place where you can focus as much as you can. Okay. And as always, we're going to start off with a do now with 8 questions. And I'm just going to mention this now that you should be reviewing some of the past lessons that we've been doing. It'll make doing the do nows much more easier. And also, we are just building on the things that you learned about, particularly lesson 10. So whenever you have time, just gloss over some of the things that we've learned about. But that being said, I'm going to let you pause the video right now and get started on the do now. Brilliant. So let's start off. Number 1, define diffusion. Okay, so this is from a couple lessons ago, and diffusion is the movement of particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. Okay, it's a passive process, doesn't need any energy, and it happens quite naturally. Number 2, define the term rate. So when you say, the rate of diffusion, you are talking about the speed at which it occurs, okay? So we use the term rate for a lot of things that happen in science, and when we say rate, we're just basically saying how fast it occurs, okay, or how slow. Number 3, identify what a partially permeable membrane is. So remember that the membrane is an organelle, basically the outer layer, and the membrane allows certain molecules to pass through. That's what partially permeable means, because only certain molecules are able to pass through. And primarily these are the ones that are small enough to fit through the membrane. Okay, if it's too big, generally it can't get through the permeable membrane. Number 4, state what variable is drawn on the y-axis. So remember that y points to the sky. If x is your independent variables, then your y has to be your dependent variable. Okay, this is the one that changes in response to the changing variable. Number 5, state 4 things a graph needs. So as always, you should always have a title on your graphs to let the reader know what they're looking at. Your x and your y axis, both of them should have labels so that you know what data you're looking at. And the last thing, I tend to choose between the two, but if you are using numerical values, a scale is quite important because you need to know what the scale of what you're looking at is, right? So, is it better to use centimeters or is it better to use kilometers, and vice versa, okay? And also with the legend, if you have more than two things on your graph, 2 lines, 2 bars, whatever it is, then you do need a legend to basically label and identify which one is which. Number 6, state what a control is used for. So this is referring to a control variable, and we talked about this last lesson, and it's basically you use a control to make sure that the experiment can be valid. All right, without a control, it loses a bit of a credibility, and you're not really sure if your experiment actually is telling you the truth. Number 7, state how we know an experiment results are valid, and that is if an experiment is reproducible, or if the results are accurate, or if there is a good control variable. So these 3 things are all things that point towards a valid experiment. And if any one of these were a bit weaker, then you would have a little bit of trouble, knowing that the experiment is valid. Number 8, state the function of the mitochondria. So this seems like a really old question, but it's actually important because we're going to visit this today. And the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and it is responsible for providing the cell with energy through respiration. Okay? Perfect. So please make sure that you have all the correct answers. I'll give you a minute, or I'll give you a second to pause the video, and we'll move on. So today we are looking at what's called active transport. All right, so by the end of this lesson, hopefully you will be able to define the term active transport and give examples, as well as explain why active transport needs energy, and how the mitochondria helps it absorb ions from dilute solutions. So to start off, I want to make sure that we remember what diffusion is because I'm going to use that term quite a bit today, and you need to know the difference between diffusion and active transport. So this is from a previous lesson. Diffusion is the movement of atoms or molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration, correct? And the thing about diffusion is that it relies heavily on what's called a concentration gradient. So there has to be some sort of concentration gradient to allow diffusion to happen. If the solution or whatever it is you're looking at, if the concentration is equal on both sides or throughout the whole system, then you're not going to get diffusion. All right, so it needs a concentration gradient in order to have diffusion. And the reason for this is because it is a passive process. It requires no energy, right? And this could be a good or bad thing because, like I said, if the concentration is the same, then diffusion is not going to happen. And so for those things that actively want to pick out certain things or to make sure you want to ensure a concentration gradient, then that's where active transport comes in. But make sure that you're familiar with diffusion first before we move on to active transport. All right, so in the previous 3 lessons, we have learned about how molecules can move passively, right, no energy, from an area of high concentration to low concentration. That's diffusion, correct? Diffusion and osmosis, we talked about those two. However, all right, sometimes molecules need to move against the concentration gradient, all right? Which means that you're moving from a low concentration to a high concentration, right? And so if I were to kind of explain this, then this would be like if you had a room full of people, right, and it was packed, right? Your natural instinct would be to get out of that room. But active transport will actively put more people into that room, okay? So you're actually going against what is natural. And this process is called active transport. Okay, and the name is quite simple. It's active because it needs energy, and it's not passive like diffusion and osmosis, and transport because molecules are moved. So that's how we get active transport. And so this process allows cells to get substances from very dilute solutions that surround them. So I'm going to show you. So the image on the screen right now is a version of active transport. And the only term on there that you might not recognize is ATP, right? ATP is just basically a biological term that we use to denote energy. All right, they're proteins that living organisms create, and they're stored energy basically. And we can use them for things like active transport. And you'll notice that the arrow is pointing down where there's a more concentrated area. And this is basically what it is. You're going from a low concentration, so the top area, to an area of high concentration, which is the bottom area. So take a look at the animation that I'm going to put on the screen right now. And you'll notice that the inside of the cell becomes highly concentrated, where the outside, or we call the extracellular fluid, becomes lowly concentrated. All right? So make sure whenever you're looking at active transport, you identify which side is high and which side is low. Okay, and that way, judging on which way the molecules are moving, then you can determine right away if it's diffusion or if it's active transport. All right, but this one is quite clear because it's very clear that there's energy being used to transport molecules. Okay, whereas diffusion, there wouldn't be a symbol for energy. It would just kind of happen. Okay? Right, so in plants then, we're going to take a look at plants and specifically at the roots. So plant roots are covered in specialized cells called root hair cells. They're adapted by having a very elongated shape. Elong just means very, very long. Okay? Elongated shape to increase surface area and a very thin cell membrane. So remember back to some of the things that we talked about in order to increase the rate of diffusion. Okay, and 2 of those things were surface area and a thin cell membrane. So there's your 2 right there actually. So an elongated shape is the similar thing is basically cutting up the cell root, right? And when you have a longer shape, you are increasing the surface area. And obviously a thin cell membrane will help diffuse much, much faster. Now, normally, When you put water into the soil around the plant, then the water will eventually move into the cell through a process called osmosis. We learned about this. However, there are mineral ions such as potassium, nitrates, and magnesium that plants need to absorb from the soil. But the only thing that is difficult about this is that they are found in very, very low quantities. All right, so take a look at the picture on the bottom right here. You have a plant cell with an elongated shape, right? And the little red dots are your minerals, right? The minerals like potassium, nitrates, magnesium. And the first thing that you're going to notice is that on the outside in the cell, right? Outside of the cell in the soil, you're going to notice that there's a very low concentration. Okay, and if you look inside the cell, there's a very high concentration of nitrates, potassium, magnesium. And this plant is just trying to get as much of the nutrients it needs, right? Because it doesn't know when the next time it's going to get this. So what it does is it goes through active transport to basically take those nutrients from the soil and forcefully take it into its cell. So active transport allows plants to take up these mineral ions using energy from mitochondria to absorb them against the concentration gradient, right? This makes sense because every cell in plants and animals have lots and lots of mitochondria. And mitochondria enables them to have that energy to absorb more nutrients from the soil. Okay, and the bottom sentence there just basically says plants need mineral ions to make complex biological molecules like proteins, as well as needing them to make healthy cells, right? So these are things, potassium, nitrates, magnesium, these are all things that plants need in order to survive and to grow, right? And so as an organism, you would want to try your best to get as much as you can, okay? So when we're looking at humans then, okay, for humans, in digestion specifically, there is a really, really good example of active transport, okay? But it happens all in different places of your body. And we're going to look at digestion much more closely in a different topic or in a different booklet, but just kind of giving you an overview of active transport. We know that digestion is a process of breaking down large molecules and absorbing them into the bloodstream, right? However, all right, sometimes the concentration in the small intestine is much lower than the concentration in the bloodstream, right? So the first thing you need to remember is what are villi, right? Because last lesson, if you forgot about this, go back and watch this, right? Villi are like these mop-like fingers in your intestines that increase the surface area, but also inside the villi are your arteries and your veins that carry those nutrients that it absorbs into your bloodstream, and then it takes it to different parts of your body, right? And the thing that we're going to look at closely today is a sugar called glucose, right? So whenever you have a fizzy drink or some sweets or candy, it's stored with a lot of energy called glucose. And your body needs glucose to survive, but it doesn't need that much. So there are going to be times when the glucose or the sugar levels in your bloodstream are much higher than the blood sugar levels in your intestines. Okay, so when there's an imbalance of this sugar levels from the inside and the outside, then naturally what's supposed to happen is if we went through diffusion, then the sugar in your blood would basically diffuse right back into your intestines, all right? But we don't want that. We want to keep that glucose. So what happens is your body, right, your intestines will actively pull the glucose from the intestines and forcefully put it into your bloodstream. Okay, and at the same time, it uses energy to do this. Okay, so that's the biggest difference between diffusion and active transport. Not too complicated, hopefully, but like I said, you always need to know where you're looking at. So most of the diagrams that you're looking at should tell you if it's high concentration or low concentration, or you can just visually see it. If there's more molecules inside than outside, then you know exactly where high and low concentrations are. And if you know which side is the inside of the cell and which side is the outside, that tells you which direction it should go, right? Depending on if it's diffusion or if it's active transport. Okay, so take a look at the next part here where there's a checkpoint. And the question asks, explain why active transport is required to move glucose from the small intestine into the bloodstream. So this is pretty much exactly what I just explained to you. If you need to re-listen to it again, just scroll back a little bit. But if you are pretty good and you have a good understanding, try and answer this question. Go ahead and pause the video. Right, so as with always, if you don't have the exact same answer as me, that's totally fine. But we're just going to go through this and see if you have something similar. So I wrote, there are times when the concentration of glucose is low in the intestines. If we allowed regular diffusion to happen, then we would lose glucose because it would diffuse from the bloodstream into the intestines. To prevent this, active transport allows glucose to be moved to a highly concentrated bloodstream. Okay? So that's how glucose will stay inside your bloodstream instead of being diffused right out. All right, and then if you go a little bit further down, you'll notice that there is a big chart. On the left side, there's osmosis, diffusion, and active transport, and it asks you to define and give examples. Okay, and with the movement of particles, just basically explain where does it go from into where. Okay. So go ahead, pause the video, take some time to do this, go back, revisit some of the previous lessons. That's totally okay with me. All right, so we're going to look at one type of transport at a time, starting off with osmosis. Okay, so osmosis, remember, is when water molecules move from dilute to concentrated solutions. Okay, so first of all, you have to remember what dilute and concentrated means. If you forgot, check back to that previous video. And the definition of osmosis is the diffusion of water molecules. Key word is water, okay? So remember that osmosis is a special term that we use. It's basically diffusion for water, okay? And we use the term dilute solution to a concentrated solution because lots of students get mixed up. They think that it goes from a low to a high concentration, which isn't necessarily true. The molecules stay where they are. It's the water that moves, okay? And another key thing is that there should be some sort of permeable membrane, all right? All right, next is diffusion. This is the basic term here. Diffusion is the movement of particles or atoms from low to high concentration, okay? So that one's pretty straightforward, and the definition is very similar to it, the movement of particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. Okay. And the last one is active transport. So active transport is the movement of particles against the concentration gradient by the use of energy. So some key things here, I guess you don't even need to have the use of energy, but even if you put the movement of particles from high to low concentration, so from low to high concentration, that works as well. But we use the phrase against the concentration gradient just to be a bit more precise, okay? And that is essentially the definition there, is that you're using energy to move particles against the concentration gradient. I know it sounds very similar, but that's because it is. So the key thing about active transport is that it uses energy. That's all you need to memorize about active transport, is that it uses up energy. And I just wanted to add on at the very end some examples. So osmosis you'll find in plants, okay? And you'll notice that osmosis happens when plants are trying to absorb water, okay? Especially when there's a low concentration of water inside the plants. Diffusion, I mean, you can go pretty much anywhere, but diffusion, we can say that we find diffusion in our lungs, right? Especially when we're taking in oxygen and the oxygen diffuses into our alveoli, which then diffuses into our bloodstream. And the last one for active transport, this one is going to be basically, we're going to use our intestines, okay? So in order to enable that glucose is being absorbed all the time, then we need active transport to pull as much glucose as possible from our intestines. Perfect. So that brings us to the knowledge check. Not too long. It was pretty simple just because we only visited one specific topic here, which was active transport. So go ahead and pause the video and finish up the knowledge check. Perfect. So number one, define active transport. So this is going to be when molecules move from a low concentration to a high concentration with energy. Okay, so keyword is that they have to use energy. Number two, identify where the energy for active transport comes from. And this one is quite simple. We get them from the mitochondria. All right. Number three, state what molecule active transport moves in plant roots. So this is those mineral ions that we find in the soil. And you can give the examples as well, potassium, nitrates, and magnesium. Those are some examples of minerals that plants need in order to grow. Number four, suggest why active transport is used in digestion. So this is a little bit of a lengthy answer, but again, just try and get the gist of it. So sometimes there's concentration gradient going the wrong way, so active transport allows nutrients to continue coming into the bloodstream. All right. So if that seems confusing to you, just go back to the checkpoint question that we just did, where it explains why, if the concentration gradient is going the wrong way, and we didn't have active transport, then we would be losing glucose from our body. Number five, state what a concentration gradient is. So concentration gradient is the difference between two sides of a membrane. Okay. Number six, state two examples of sites of diffusion in the human body. So these are just giving you examples of where you can find places of diffusion. So lungs is a very, very important one. And your intestines, I know that I said active transport goes on there, but so does diffusion. Okay, both occurs at the same time. Number seven, state where in a plant the green pigment is found. So there's a reason why most plants are green, and that's because of the chloroplasts. Okay, and in the chloroplasts, you'll find the pigment called chlorophyll, which is the reason why plants are green. And number eight, identify what a prokaryote is. So this is going way, way back into some of the first lessons that we did in this booklet. And a prokaryote is generally a single cell organism that does not have a membrane-bound nucleus, right? So the DNA just kind of floats around in the cytoplasm, and that's your prokaryote. So again, there's one more question that we're going to do after this, but just make sure that you have the correct answers on the knowledge check. Right, so number 9, just a really simple one. Root hair cells need energy for active transport, so they need a high concentration of what subcellular component? So remember that subcellular component just stands for organelles. All right, so what organelle is needed so they have the energy for active transport, and that is the mitochondria. They need a lot of mitochondria for energy. And the second part asks, and what chemical process does this component carry out? The mitochondria is used for a lot of different things. This one we're talking about active transport, but basically the chemical process is called respiration. All right. So mitochondria are responsible for undergoing respiration to provide the cell with the energy that it needs, not just for active transport, but for a lot of different things. Okay. And that is it. Well done for making it through the cell biology booklet. I hope you had fun listening in and you learned quite a bit. All right. Thank you.